Welcome to another Motley Fool conversation. I'm Andy Cross. David Epstein is the author of the #1 New York Times bestseller range, Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World, and he's the author of The Sports Gene. His latest book is Inside the Box, How Constraints Make Us Better. David, welcome back to the Motley Fool.
Thank you for having me. It's nice to be back.
Yeah, I say, well, thanks for being here. I say welcome back because you spoke at our annual Motley Fool member event back in 2019, and it was fantastic. Thank you for being there, and now thank you for being back here talking to our members. Let's talk about your new book. I have it right here, Inside the Box, How Constraints Make Us Better. Let's get right to the chase. How do constraints, David, make us better?
Broadly speaking, they can force us to clarify our priorities and to launch into productive exploration. And those are two things that, because of the way our brains work, which they are wired for convenience, which you might call laziness, we very rarely do those things to the extent that we should unless we are forced by useful constraints.
Now, I know some of your book, some of the inspiration for the book came from a class that you took in college studying haikus. Now, haikus are poems that are 3 lines. First line is 5 syllables. Second line is 7 syllables. The third line is 5 syllables. I've actually started writing some haikus myself just because it does really kind of help focus. But what makes a constraint so well designed as opposed to so stifling? I think some of us think of constraints as stifling. Why are they not stifling, and why are they actually beneficial?
Yeah, not just some of us. I think the word is practically synonymous with something that's frustrating. And in fact, there's a recent international survey by psychologists of known creativity myths. So these are things we know from research are not true. And the most popular one was that people are most creative when they're most free. And I think, in fact, because our brains, again, are made for, as the cognitive scientist Daniel Willingham says, not for thinking, but for preventing you from having to think whenever possible, that we will reach for easy, convenient solutions, path of least resistance, unless that is blocked and we're forced to go in another direction. So constraints are incredibly useful for getting us to think in new ways. I think the challenge is when constraints give people a feeling of taking away agency. You know, say your boss gives you some directive and it feels so stifling. First of all, if you get that directive and say, could I still surprise myself? And if the answer is no, then it's too constrained, right? Because the whole point is to get people to think in different and productive ways. But short of that, we actually need constraints that force us off the most convenient ideas and get us to do our best work. And in many cases, that actually lead to personal satisfaction.
And you open the story about Dmitry Mendeleev and his vision, the story of how he apparently came up with a periodic table from a dream, but it actually is not true, and it's actually kind of a little bit of a myth. But I think the prevalence, where I'm going with this, is the prevalence of thinking outside the box instead of inside the box, and having kind of like the eureka moment, the brilliance of all of a sudden coming up with this great idea is kind of mythologized in society. Why is that, and why are constraints kind of sometimes considered the second best option?
Yeah, and so just to give the detail on that, so the idea was that he developed the periodic table, which motivated the search for atoms and all these things in a dream. And this is like, it's in the blockbuster book Why We Sleep. It's like Casper used it in marketing their mattresses, etc. The reality was he had a contract to write a 2-volume Intro to Chemistry textbook, and he'd only gotten 8 of the then 63 known elements in Volume 1. Had to get the other 55 in Volume 2, and it led him to experiment with groups, basically. And so I had learned the myth version in college chemistry, and so I thought the gap between the myth and the reality is symbolic of something important, that we undervalue useful constraints and overvalue complete freedom. And I think maybe some of what you're getting at is that in the abstract, people always report wanting more freedom and more choice and all these things. And so I think we like that idea of, if our brains were just more free and more open, that we would do our best thinking. But the reality from a mountain of research is that not only when that becomes reality do we make worse decisions. I mean, there's research showing that once 401k options get above a certain set, people just stop participating.
Yeah.
right? Because they don't even know what to do. We're less happy with our decisions when the field is too open. We don't think our best thoughts, and we're less happy when we have too much freedom and we're having to make tons of decisions about every little thing. And so I think something that seems wonderful in the abstract turns out in reality not to align with the way that we thrive because of the way that our brains are built.
It's fascinating because I think you talk about a study about cancer, and if people wanted to choose their own cancer, for those who had cancer, choose their own cancer options. But in theory, it's like we want to choose our own ways to try to address cancer if we ever got cancer. But for those people who do have cancer, they actually choose to be, they don't want the freedom. They don't want the freedom to make that decision. So the theory is on one hand, but the reality from either the data or just the fact that we're wired this way is really different. And I think that's hard for some of us to kind of get around because we want the freedom. We think we want the freedom, but the reality is it's very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I thought it was in many ways an interesting topic to write about, because there's this disconnect between what we feel we should want, what we think we want, and what is actually best for us, right? And even between like classical economic models where it's always good to have more choice, right? Because that's just more options. You'll come to a better decision. But the reality of it is that people don't, whether it's healthcare decisions, whether it's investing decisions, is that when the options are too many and the constraints and guardrails are too few, people not only make worse decisions, they're less happy with their decisions, and they're much more prone to regret. And so what seems like it should be true based on our intuition, based on classical economic models, just is not true in reality.
I often think about that when I rewatch The Matrix, and I'm wondering, would I actually choose the red pill or the blue pill? Which one do I want? The more choice? Do I want more choice? Do I really want to be told kind of what to do? We'll get into some of the investing later on, talking about some of the how the different concepts you've brought in the book relate to investing. But let's get to business. I recently interviewed Stephen Witt, who is the author of The Thinking Machine, a fantastic book about NVIDIA co-founder and CEO Jensen Huang. I know you read it because you have a nice blurb on the cover. Stephen talked about Jensen's willingness to pursue these markets long before there were any constraints, these billion-dollar opportunities, long before there were even customers. How do you square that side of that kind of outside-the-box thinking with this idea that constraints make us better inside of business?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that Jensen also did is made sure to keep things small and focused on very well-defined problem solving early on. I mean, so early on they were doing computer graphics, period. And that's not because Jensen Huang thought that the only applications for this were computer graphics. He used it the same way that Jeff Bezos used books, right? Where it was, I'm trying to make something much bigger, but in the meantime, I need a very defined problem that I can work on to get started. So Bezos chose books because if people ordered it, they knew what they were getting, right? It wasn't going to break in shipping, so you weren't going to have tons of returns and things like that. But that was just this stepping stone problem to see, can I start problem solving in this context? And if I can do that, then you can start expanding from that. And that's the same thing that Jensen did with computer graphics. It was, here's a defined problem where it keeps it small and contained enough and well-defined enough that we can experiment in this well-defined case, and then we can build from there. And when companies or organizations haven't done that, where they jump ahead to the full vision, that's where they tend to have a disaster. Yeah,
you talk about in your new book this great story about the rise and fall of a company called General Magic, a company that had really, as you write, too much creative freedom fueled by too much money. So tell us the story of General Magic and what you learned from it.
Yeah, so General Magic was the first so-called concept IPO in Silicon Valley history. So Goldman Sachs took the company public in the mid-90s with an idea, not a product, because their vision was so incredible. And their vision was right, by the way. So they were making a personal communicator, basically the iPhone. Yeah. It was founded by 3 former Apple employees, 2 who had designed the original Mac, and 1 who was just this absolute visionary. His job had been looking at the future of technology, a guy named Mark Peratt. And, I mean, I read his PhD dissertation in reporting. It's like eerie. He coins the term information economy on the first page. And he sees the next half century of
Wow.
what's coming, both the promise and the problems. And in 1989, he's sketching in his notebook a thin glass rectangle with no protruding buttons and a touchscreen and rectangular apps that was going to be a remote-a-phone pewter, as it said near the diagram. And so they have the vision. So money pours in. They have so many international telecommunications companies invest millions of dollars and come on board that they have to start meetings with an antitrust lawyer listing all the things they're not allowed to talk about. And this is beginning when only 15% of American households even have computers. And Peratt later says that his goal in raising all this money so quickly was to create heaven for engineers, where they were free to play and create. No limits. What more could anyone want? He asked. And I think the answer was a little less freedom, because they could do anything. And so they did do anything. Every time someone had a good idea, they added it on, and the project grew and grew and grew. And they're missing deadlines. And I interviewed dozens of former employees, and the refrain was, gosh, I just couldn't figure out what not to do. Mm. They couldn't figure out what not to do. So they did so much that the product, it just kept growing, and it was essentially incoherent by the time it appeared. Nobody could figure out what they were supposed to do with the thing, and it was a disaster. So the stock price had doubled on the first day when they went public. By 2 years later, it was essentially worthless.
Oh, yeah.
And so it was really this cautionary tale. In some ways, it was a success, though, because so many of the people inside learned these lessons about the importance of boundaries and constraints, and they went on to create technology that every single person listening to this has used.
Bill Gurley, the legendary VC investor who, as you write, is invested in Uber and Zillow, his line is more startups die of indigestion than starvation. It's kind of, we're in this environment now where, there are echoes of the 90s with the amount of capital that is flooding through AI. Do you still think, do you believe, first of all, your reaction to what Bill writes about startups, and do you think it also applies to companies that aren't startups, that have been around for years and years and years, this idea of that they die of indigestion than more die from indigestion than starvation? Maybe unwrap that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, I think, and by the way, Bill wasn't the only one. There were several people that claimed that was their line when I was interviewing them. So I don't know really what the origin of it is. Yeah. But like Tony Fadell, who co-founded Nest, also says, he's like, that's my line. But I actually think it has never been easier to do too much than right now. And over the last year, I've spent some time with with one particular company that helps other companies implement AI. And one of the things I've seen as I've been doing that is that a lot of companies are rushing to implement, right? It's alluring, it's powerful, they feel their competitors are ahead of them. And so they implement, and it's a sprawling implementation and leads to what researchers are starting to call work slop. Incredible amount of volume of stuff, not all of it connected to the larger strategy, kind of unclear who's supposed to deal with all this stuff sometimes. And so the companies that have done it successfully, the ones that I've been exposed to at least, have said, all right, we're going to really well define the problem we're trying to solve. And then how does the tool match to that? It's almost like they're mapping the jobs to be done in an organization and saying, where does the tool fit? And so this is another case where it's not what Bill Gurley was talking about with just capital alone, but with the tool that can do so much that people are often applying it in this incredibly sprawling way where they haven't taken the time to define the bounding box or the problem it's really solving. And I think that's one of the reasons why the productivity data so far is surprisingly disappointing for how much implementation there's actually been.
And then you spend at various points in the book just talking about focus and distractions and switching costs and all those kinds of things, which also go a little bit to this outside the box thinking that we all think that we can do it much better than we actually can, and the impacts not just on business and work, but also just life in general, because the thought that we can handle a lot more outside the box than we can inside the box.
Yeah, I mean, if you're thinking about the research on sort of attention and focus, that went into the book, I mean, that was kind of the scariest chapter to me,
right?
Because I think at this point in human history, if you are not structuring your attention and focus, it is being done to you.
Yeah.
And a lot of that chapter focused on the work of a psychologist named Gloria Mark, who for about 25 years now, has been studying people at work. And when she started in the early 2000s, people were switching tasks about every 3 minutes on average. By 2012, it was every 75 seconds. By 2022, it was every 45 seconds. And she found the average in an office, the average office worker, and she was embedded in big companies, Microsoft, things like that. And she found that on average, people are checking email 77 different times a day. Yeah. So it's not 77 emails, 77 different checks. And they're huge switching costs. As she described it, your brain is like a whiteboard. And when you switch, you erase what was on the board, but the residue is still there and it interferes, and that builds up over the course of the day. And so not only are you worse, so she found that the number of times you switched was directly negatively related to your productivity by the end of the day. Wow. But we also now know that it's really stressful, like by physiological measures, that switching builds up stress. And so unless you're really structuring your attention, doing things like blocking, where maybe you have to answer all those emails, but can you do it in 1 or 2 or 3 blocks where you're doing email and then you're not doing email when you're not doing that? Because if you're not, you get accustomed to this cadence. And then even if you say, now it's time to focus, you will self-interrupt with intrusive thoughts at the rate to which you've become accustomed, as if you have this like internal distraction barometer. So you really want to do monotasking blocks, both for stress and for productivity.
Well, and then just even having it, like just having the phone right here on your desk as you write, and others have studied, just that itself is a distraction, even if it's not doing anything.
That's right. That's right. It's actually shown in cognitive tests. People will score more poorly if the phone is visible. Phone visible on the desk in front of you, worse score. Phone in a pocket or a bag, better. Phone out of the room and not visible, even better, because you will start wondering constantly what you should be checking. If people want to do something about this and they have some trouble, one thing to start is put it outside of the room. You'll have these self-interruptions. You almost feel like a physical pull to check it. Keep a pad next to you and write down the thought when it pops into your mind. It's called cognitive outsourcing. So at least that can get it out of your working memory so it's not distracting you as much. And then it only takes a few days to start having a little bit more of a sane rhythm.
That's great. Excuse me while I walk outside and put my phone outside the office here. Let's get back to business, David. So another company you write about is Pixar, and how its co-founder and longtime president, Ed Catmull, incorporated constraints in the creative process. Tell us a little bit about the Pixar experience.
Yeah, I liked to contrast Pixar to General Magic because General Magic was total creative freedom, and Pixar was evolving at exactly the same time, equally audacious vision to make the world's first fully computer animated feature film. And it's thought of as this place of kind of unfettered imagination, I think, where in fact it is a place of very many fetters that channel creative ideas into creative achievement. And so, for example, they would keep things as small as humanly possible for as long as possible in film. So directors can spend years in story development, stripping away complexities in a story. Like Schadenfreude was a character from Inside Out that got pulled out because it's adding too much complexity. And that might seem wasteful to spend years in that phase, but the costs only explode once you move into production. So staying that small in the long run actually ends up being really efficient. And they have all sorts of rules for creators, like one that I adopted for my own writing called the 3 pitches rule, where they find that people fall in love with their first idea, even though it's usually not their best one. It's called the creative cliff illusion. We think our best ideas come first or not at all, but in fact, they usually come later. And so they were forced to pitch 3 different ideas. So that was not a suggestion. It was a rule, the 3 pitches rule. They just had all kinds of rules and constraints that would help people who otherwise could get carried away in the way General Magic did. Actually, one I loved was what Ed told me about. They called the beautifully shaded penny problem. So this problem at General Magic was if someone had a good idea, they did it. Like they could never figure out when to stop. The beautifully shaded penny problem was named because directors might get fixated on the shading on a penny in the background of a shot that the audience would never see. Some inconsequential detail. And they'd keep working on it while other things needed to be done. So they came up with how's this for a high-tech fix? Popsicle sticks Velcroed to a board. Each popsicle stick represented the amount of work one animator could do in 1 week. And if that director wanted to keep animating that penny, they had to start taking away popsicle sticks from other characters and moving it to the penny. So making that constraint visible instantly solved the problem.
That's really brilliant. You know, I was thinking when I was talking to Mac, our producer, about your work and just the story of Pixar. I was thinking about Steve Jobs because my recollection or thinking around Steve Jobs is obsessive about these details, like the shaded penny. And so just thinking about the brilliance of someone like that, and how do they stay focused enough, or how are they able to kind of unwrap that really focused detail with, like, oh my gosh, I have lots of other things to get to and to do in running a business or just in my life.
Yeah. Funny thing so there's a few things about Steve Jobs. One, by the way, is he was banned from certain meetings at Pixar because they felt his opinion would carry too much weight, even if it wasn't good. This is the hippo principle: highest paid person's opinion carries too much weight. But he was, I think people who have read about him much probably know that there were times when he was a micromanager, right? Mm-hmm. But I wasn't reporting about Apple, but because of some of the other reporting I was doing, like General Magic, I ended up interviewing a ton of people who worked with Steve Jobs. And what came through to me was that one of the big differences in the time, you know, after those so-called years in the wilderness where he was pushed out of Apple and then he came back in the late 90s, was that when he came back, so like when he was at Next Computers, he had this famous thing where he wanted the hard drive casing to be in this perfect cube in a certain metal, and it drove the engineers crazy because they had no freedom to problem solve inside of that. But when he came back to Apple, what I was told is he was much more like, I'm going to really define the problem, but then I'm going to trust my people and let them do their thing. So as it was portrayed to me with some of the people that worked with him, the big area of growth for him was setting the boundaries and letting brilliant people problem solve. So I think he may have evolved in his career to the point where he became obsessive about setting up the problem and what is it that they were trying to do, and simplifying that as much as he could. And that actually liberated people to then go and create. And I mean, even when he first came back to Apple, I think it was 97 maybe, Apple at the time was making printers and servers and the handheld thing, the Newton, like they had a million different computer models. And he drew on a whiteboard, famously, a 2x2 grid, and on one axis it said consumer and pro, and on the other desktop and portable. We're only going to have 4 products, period. And people were upset because he killed most of the stuff they were doing, but that complexity was stealing clarity. And by narrowing it down to these buckets, it actually liberated people to problem solve.
That's wonderful. Yeah. So setting the boundaries from a management perspective and from a systems perspective, even as you evolve into a leader of a multi-billion-dollar business, really important. So thank you for sharing that. Let's talk a little bit about investing, David. So the Motley Fool is all about helping investors become smarter, happier, and richer. So how can constraints help us with investing, do you think?
Well, for one, I think we can set kind of budgets for ourselves in a way. So let's say one interview I did a little while ago was with and this wasn't actually in the book, but it was sort of for a newsletter, basically, with the general manager of the Chicago Bears. And his name's Ryan Poles. And a few years ago, he inherited a football team that was basically a teardown, right? And one of the really important things he did when they came in, and then this last year they won their first playoff game in 15 years, I think. And one of the things he did was set internal budgets for different things. And this is surprisingly hard to do because fans, reporters can see how much money you have under the salary cap and how much you're not spending. And so they can look at you as being cheap, right? And he said, we have to tune that out. We know that unexpected things are going to happen over the season. There's going to be injuries. There are going to be free agents. And so we need this budget, this sort of dry powder that we're not going to spend, and people are going to call us cheap, but it's going to allow us to be adaptable and take some risks down the road. And they stuck to that. And it meant that they were sort of trading draft picks to get more draft picks sometimes in later rounds. We wanted more shots on goal. And I think that's kind of smart and analogous, one, to setting aside this other pot where you can say, all right, I'm not spending this right now, but it's here for opportunities that come up, because things are going to come up. And also taking sort of more shots on goal, where I would think instead of making like putting all your kind of eggs in one basket, identifying what are some reasonable risks to take, and spreading that out a little bit, so that you have those shots on goal. Because one thing about investing is like the worst you can do is negative 100%, right, in investment. But the best you can do is, theoretically infinity, right?
Yeah, sure.
It's like it's not a grand slam, right? In a grand slam in baseball, you can only score 4 runs. A grand slam, if you're investing, you score 1,000,000 runs.
Oh, sure.
And so I think having some of those shots on goal where you're disciplining yourself, maybe these are small amounts, but making sure that you're kind of almost taking enough risk.
Yeah.
In some ways.
Yeah.
And that requires decision rules, I think.
Yeah, and that's great because I do want to ask about one of the people that you write that you say that if you had to choose a real one single thinker who really influenced the book, it was Professor Herb Simon and his work on decision making. Now, he was a polymath and he did a lot of research on how we make decisions and whether we're maximizing or whether what he calls satisficing, not letting perfection be the enemy of the really very good. So unpack those ideas and why that research resonated so much to you when it comes to decision making, which is so important as we think about making investing decisions.
Yeah, and Simon, as you mentioned, he was trained as a political scientist, but he won the highest awards in computer science and psychology. He won the Nobel Prize in economics. But all of the work revolved around how humans make decisions. And what he found was that we cannot really optimize the way that economic theory, according to like the rational actor model of humans, because we have limited bandwidth, we have limited ability to predict the future, so we have to use shortcuts. And one of those shortcuts he called satisficing. We use good enough rules to get to things, and he argued that we should do this very proactively, because we actually spend a ton of time and energy on attempting to optimize, even though we can't. And so he had decision rules for everything he did. Like, what is good enough? And that helped him avoid what's called Fredkin's paradox, where we end up spending the most time on the least important decisions because the options are hard for us to tell apart. And that probably means it doesn't matter much, or if it does, we can't figure it out. And yet that's where we spend a lot of our energy, just because the options seem similar. And so I think when it comes to any kind of decision making, before you get into the heated part of choosing, setting these satisficing rules, or what would good enough look like here. And the evidence is that typically once you've reached that, applying more effort actually isn't going to make your decision any better. It may make you feel better, but it's not going to make your decision any better. So thinking about that ahead of time, whether it's, purchasing stock or purchasing a broom on Amazon, like what is good enough here?
Right.
And once you get to that, recognize that your decision quality is really not going to go up anymore, and just stick with it.
Yeah, the quote that you talk about is that Simon says is people are always faced with imperfect information about their options and equipped with limited ability to anticipate the consequences of their choices. And investors, we're always dealing with imperfect information. Yeah. Yet I feel like investors always want perfect information to make that perfect timing around a buy or a sell. And so the concept of this idea of maximizing versus satisficing and dealing with imperfect information for investors, I think, is very important.
Yeah, I mean, wanting perfect information, I understand, but that's exactly the tension that he was getting at, is that we think we can do this. We think we want more information, but the evidence is it does not improve our decision quality. And to quote a line that has influenced some of my own investing, it comes from the illustrious David Gardner, co-founder of The Fool. When we were having a conversation about trying to buy or sell at the right time, there's the classic saying, buy low, sell high. Yeah. David said, buy high, never sell.
Yeah, that's right.
Don't try to do that. If a company's good, buy it. Don't worry about that timing. Yeah. And I think that's an amazing decision rule that is doing exactly what Simon said, is you're having that good enough decision rule, like the perfection you want, you're not going to get it anyway. There's no evidence you'll improve your decision quality. And so having those kinds of simple decision rules that are based on a principle, I think can be really powerful.
Well, I think that there's also some Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky in here too, with the idea that we feel our losses twice as much as we feel our gains, especially with money, but I think decisions in general. And it kind of leads to this analysis paralysis or even the paradox of choice when we have many decisions. Like, I mean, there are something like 4 ETFs created almost every day now. Like there are more ETFs than there are public stocks. So it's like the decisions you mentioned about 401ks. Maybe we talk a little bit about this, like the plethora of information out there for investors to try to digest and how it can be a little bit overwhelming and how we really need boundaries maybe to help us and really focus on certain things when making those decisions.
Yeah, I mean, that 401k research again is pretty clear. It's as the choice set gets bigger and more complex, more people just back out of it because they're just having trouble making a decision. So in hoping that they'll get perfect information, they're putting it off, right? And often end up never making a decision at all, which is the worst case scenario. Right. I haven't seen any research yet about this proliferation of ETFs. That's really interesting. I didn't realize it was 4 a day that are being created. And I wonder if some of that, because I've noticed that with like Vanguard, like I get fed a lot of their emails about new ETFs, and I even look into some of them, and I can't even tell the difference between some of them. So it seems to me that they are just trying to make sometimes more possibilities, even though there's not that much material difference between them, or maybe just an excuse to email saying we've got something new that like prompts you to remember maybe to buy something. I don't really know, but I don't actually think it's good for decision quality. Right? I think like having some basic, simple principles and sticking to those, and then all these other bells and whistles are mostly a distraction and marginal stuff at best anyway. So I think knowing what those principles are before you get into that morass of all the bells and whistles is really important.
I do want to get into some AI, and just as you think about the world of AI now, with this idea of how boundaries can help us when information and knowledge is more available to us than ever before. But on the investing side, just maybe a little thoughts on your own investing style. If you think about maximizing, satisficing when you're investing on your own.
Oh, big time satisficer. Big time. I'm not attempting to maximize. Like lots of stuff just in simple, David's going to be mad at me for saying this. Lots of stuff just in simple index funds and things like that. In part because I want simplicity.
Right.
But I do keep, I do a certain amount of money for particular bets I want to make. When I think about my money, I think about money that I can afford to lose and money that I can't. And if I can't afford to lose it, I want it in something really conservative. And if I can afford to lose it, I'm okay with taking a fair bit of risk. So I want some pretty risky things. So I will invest in some individual stocks if I just think a company is great. And I don't attempt to buy it low. I do the Gardner. I say wherever it is, when I decide I want to buy it and don't worry about it. And then there are a few cases where I have particular specific interests in things, where I'll invest in those as well. Yeah.
Excellent. And we are fans of ETFs and simple investing, and then adding on stocks as you kind of grow and as you wish. So I don't think David will be mad at you for saying that, David. Let's just talk a little bit about AI because it's so important. Personally, how do you use AI, and talk a little bit about this idea about boundaries in a world where knowledge now is. It used to be information is free. Now, really, knowledge is free more so than ever before.
Yeah, it's there's an infinite ability to start things that you're not going to finish now. and I will say the one thing about knowledge is I have noticed, because I'm like sampling a bunch of different AI programs and I subscribe to all the pro things, and they still are wrong quite a lot in surprising ways. Like I came across something the other day where I was like, it was telling me a fact about Charles Darwin's pen pals. Okay. And I said, gosh, that's so interesting that it knows this thing, but it's a little bit wrong. Mm-hmm. And so I asked, what is your source? And it was me.
Oh, that's funny.
Some snippet of things I had written that someone posted on Goodreads, and the AI had taken 2 adjacent paragraphs and kind of conflated them as if they were the same. Yeah. And there is no chance. I may be the only person in the world who would have seen, and a few researchers who would have seen this and said, oh, that's not actually right. Yeah. So there's some part of me that thinks it may be actually more important than it used to be to sort of know some things or have like a sense of, to have actually some general knowledge so that you know when things don't sound right, where it can go wrong. But on the other hand, that's a digression. How do I use AI? So my most impactful use is not the typical, LLM use, although I have used some Claude Code to do some things that I couldn't have done in the past. But um, my best use case has been using an online tool and then building a version of it myself, where I have thousands, I have tens of thousands from 20 years of being a science writer, and even before that, working in science, of research papers on my computer. And I was using this tool and then again used AI to make my own version of it, where I can put in a paper and it will make a map for me showing all the other papers on my computer that cite that paper.
Yeah, fast.
And how cited those ones are by other papers. So it's like, which are the important things here? And then it can dump out a list where it has little excerpts of how my paper is cited in those papers. So I can see, is this a passing mention? Is it substantive? Is it a disagreement? You can attempt to sort by agreeing and disagreeing. And that's something I used to do by control Fing through a gazillion PDFs.
Yes.
So that's something that turned 10 hours into one for me. And it took away something that was really boring and just laborious. So that's my biggest case where it's really made me more efficient.
That is funny. I do find Control F is now becoming less and less used on my keyboard as I am using more of the tools to help do that sorting and searching for me. In your book Range, you write about the value of being a generalist versus a specialist. Does this change in the world of AI?
I think my first answer is I don't know, but I think so I've been following other people to look at answers to that. And so far, it seems like the feeling is that AI will cause even more advantages for generalists. And I think I've actually seen the book Range is having a bit of a second life. And I think it's because of that, where like the Wall Street Journal, did a package on the future of work.
Yeah.
And I think it was like 2 of the 5 people they were focused on said that they think this will lead to more of a rise of the generalists, where a lot of kind of information, even a lot of skills are commodified. And so you really need these people who can wear different hats and connect things, and that there'll be more businesses that can get big with a very small number of people who are just wearing different hats. Mm-hmm. The Financial Times did an analysis that showed that the returns to sort of collaborative and leadership type skills are outpacing technical skills at an increasing rate, which is a little surprising. So I think certainly specialists, building AI models for sure, no question about it. But even the guy who built Claude Code recently said that they want only engineers who have side quests, like other things that they do. And so I think there seem to be signals that this could be really good for generalists. And I would say in general, technological disruption often shifts humans up to this higher strategic level of thinking. So I think it's going to be more important than ever for people to think about how their role connects to the larger strategy of whatever it is they're trying to do in their organization.
It's fascinating as you were talking. If you take Range and you take Inside the Box, there's a Venn diagram somewhere there where because generalists, maybe they think or they want to be more outside the box, more polymathic, to say, where specialists may be more focused or inside the box. And I feel like there's some Venn diagram that matches up generalists with inside the box thinking. That's kind of where we want to be. Yeah,
I mean, maybe the subtext of what you're asking too is that it could seem like these 2 books can be contradictory in certain ways too, right? And I think, to me, coming from Range, the Inside the Box felt like a natural next question, where it's like, okay, Range is about having broad experiences, broad toolbox, all these things, broad, like Charlie Munger said, you want a lot of different mental models that you can just apply.
Right.
And then Inside the Box was about, okay, once you've got those, how do you focus those into achievement? Right? Because I struggle with that, right? I've had a career zigzagged. I'm really widely curious. And so my challenge is it isn't having ideas. It's like figuring out what to actually do and drawing boundaries around that work. So to me, I think you're right that it feels like a compliment to me of you can do all these different things in the world, which is wonderful, but also means it's a bigger challenge to figure out what actually to do in the world.
Any ending guidance around a tool or something we can start today to help us think about constraints in a very positive way and how we can really kind of get inside the box in the most effective way possible.
Yeah, again, to reiterate, I hope Inside the Box is kind of a mental or emotional reframe for how we face limits. And that we can come to see them as opportunities to clarify priorities or to experiment in new ways. And so one thing that I think can be really useful, I write in the book about a genomics lab that did this, and then I adopted it myself, is to make all of your current commitments visible. Post-it notes on a wall, for example. And usually what people will see is that they have more things going than they can actually get done, and that a lot of kind of maybe medium priorities are competing with the higher priorities. And I think we don't like to drop things in process. In fact, humans have what's called additive bias. We overlook solutions that involve taking things away in order to solve problems. I think in this world with so much information and so many tools and so many possibilities, we should be doing subtraction audits once in a while. We're making visible all the things we're doing. It's almost like those popsicle sticks on the Velcro at Pixar. It's like, here are all the priorities. We can't weight them all equally. We're mortals. We have a limited time on Earth. We have limited attention to focus. So I think we should regularly go through this practice of saying, what can I take away here so that I can focus on the things that are the most important?
It reminds me of the Glenn Ross play, Always Be Closing, just always trying to focus and finish on things. I think that's good, just overall guidance for so many of us in a world where just now, especially with AI, just the information, the overflow and the distractions are just coming from all over the place. And
you will always get more, right? Again, so we have two biases, additive bias, and the cousin is subtraction neglect bias. We don't take away. So as you just go through life, you'll add more and more commitments, meetings, tools, dashboards, etc. So regular subtraction audits, because we don't do it naturally. So otherwise you'll just only build and add more, and it'll dilute the most important things.
Before I close, the one stat in the book that you mentioned was since the Industrial Revolution, the amount of choice has grown like 100 million times, I think, whereas just wealth has created maybe, is it 400,000 X or something like that? Just the difference is just incredible.
Yeah, and that was consumer choice, specifically 100 million fold. And it's actually gotten to the point where some research now finds that when these choice sets gets enormous for consumer products, people start to view their decision as like an extension of their identity, and it becomes freighted with all this weight, and if they're much more prone to regret and all these kinds of things. So I think we need to have our own limits to protect ourselves from feeling FOMO about all of our decisions all of the time.
That's great. Inside the box certainly helps with that. We started with haiku, David. I want to end with a haiku, courtesy of our producer, Matt Greer here. Grade us on how this haiku sounds.
Okay.
David Epstein's book, Inside the Box is the name, Productive Constraints.
I love it.
How'd
it's
Matt
great.
do?
I think it's beautiful. There's one aspect of like the classical haiku rules that it doesn't meet, but that doesn't matter because we should use haiku for what it's good for us, which is that the normal ones, you describe something physical in the world that you see as if you're like cupping a firefly in your hand and showing that moment to someone else. But I think there's no reason for us to need to adhere to 17th century norms about poetry writing. So I think it's perfect.
Well, that's great. I think that was Mac's college major at the University of Texas. David, thank you for being here with us at the Motley Fool. The book is Inside the Box, How Constraints Make Us Better. And you can follow David on Substack, so go out there and check him out. David, thank you so much for being back here. I hope you join us back here again for another Motley Fool conversation.
That's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.